Today, Joel Casamayor lives a life so quiet that many people have almost forgotten who he once was. There are no more cheers, no more championship belts raised high in the ring, no more nights when millions of people followed his every punch. But that silence has never meant peace. For more than 35 years, Joel Casamayor has carried a life that few truly understand. He lives like a man who belongs to two worlds, but does not fully belong to either. Part of his heart remains forever in Cuba, where he was born, where the poor streets of Guantánamo raised the boy Joel, where his family, childhood, and first dreams began. But the rest of his life was built on American soil, where he found the opportunity, freedom, and future that his homeland could not give him. To have that second life, he had to give up his first one. It was not just an escape. It was the moment a man had to accept that he might never live as he did before. Every victory afterward carried a quiet pain. Every step forward pulled part of his memories left behind. There were nights when he was the world champion, but deep in his heart he was still the Cuban boy who missed his homeland. There were moments when he stood in the bright lights of Las Vegas, but in his mind appeared images of his family and the poor life where he once belonged. It was precisely that adversity that created Joel Casamayor's extraordinary will. He did not allow loss to defeat him. He turned longing into motivation, turned loneliness into strength, and turned sacrifice into the reason to keep moving forward when so many others had given up long ago. What Joel Casamayor achieved in his career is enough to put his name among the greatest Cuban boxers of all time. Before becoming a professional star, he built a brilliant amateur career with a record of more than 360 wins, winning the gold medal at the Barcelona Olympics in 1992 in the featherweight division, the silver medal at the World Championships in 1993, and many other major international titles. After arriving in the United States and starting over from zero, he continued to conquer professional boxing by becoming a world champion in multiple weight classes. Casamayor once held the WBA super featherweight belt, the WBC lightweight belt, and the ring lightweight champion title. He defeated many top opponents such as Diego Corrales, Michael Katsidis, Jose Armando Santa Cruz, and many other elite boxers during the golden era of boxing. Experts consider him one of the most technical boxers of his generation, famous for his crafty southpaw style, excellent counterpunching ability, and superior tactical thinking. Although he never received media attention equal to the biggest superstars of the era, Joel Casamayor is still respected by the boxing community as a true champion, a man who succeeded in both worlds, the world of Cuban amateur boxing and the harsh world of American professional boxing. But behind all those belts, victories, and titles, there is still a question that has never truly been answered. Can any achievement fully compensate for the price he had to pay to achieve them? If Joel Casamayor's story makes you think about the real price of success, please hit like and subscribe to the channel to join us on these emotional journeys. And now, let us return to Guantánamo in the years of poverty, where a Cuban boy had no idea that one day he would have to trade his homeland to pursue his dream. Long before the world knew Joel Casamayor as an Olympic champion or a world champion, long before the cheers echoed in the arenas of Las Vegas and Atlantic City, there was once a small boy who grew up on the dusty streets of Guantánamo, Cuba. It was not the life that most Americans usually imagine when they think of sports champions. There were no modern training facilities. There were no wide-open opportunities. There were no talent scouts appearing to change his life overnight. There was only long days of hardship, simple meals, and constant worry about tomorrow. Guantánamo in the 1970s was not a place that nurtured big dreams. It was a place where people learned to survive before learning to hope. Joel was born into an ordinary working-class family, where every peso had to be carefully calculated. His family's life was like millions of other Cuban families at that time. They were not rich. They had no privileges. They only had hard work and the belief that tomorrow might be better than today. But often even that belief became a luxury. As a child, Joel became accustomed to seeing his parents work non-stop to maintain their lives. He grew up in an environment where children understood responsibility very early. No one had time to pamper childhood. No one had the conditions to pursue distant hobbies. Every day revolved around how to keep the family surviving. The children in the neighborhood did not talk about becoming famous or millionaires. They talked about getting a stable job, having enough food, and helping their parents. Joel was no different. He did not grow up thinking he would become a boxing legend. As a child, he only hoped for a better life than what he saw every day. But that was the period when Cuba placed a lot of expectations on sports. The state saw sports as national pride. Talented children were put into specialized training programs from a very young age. For many poor families, it was one of the few paths that could open a different future. And then boxing appeared in Joel's life. At first, it was not love. It was not passion. It was simply a door, a rare opportunity, a path that a poor boy could walk and hope that his life would not be like the lives of previous generations. In the simple training rooms, amid the sound of gloves colliding and the shouts of coaches, Joel began to realize that he had something special. But talent did not make life easier. On the contrary, it brought very early sacrifices. While many other children could stay with their families, Joel had to spend more and more time training. While his peers could play on the streets, he had to wake up early in the morning to do physical training. His childhood gradually was replaced by training sessions, selections, and increasingly high expectations. There were days when his body ached so much that he did not want to continue. There were times when he missed home, missed his family, and wondered if all of this was worth it. But every time he saw his family's situation, every time he witnessed his parents continuing to struggle with life, Joel returned to the training room. He understood that boxing might not be the easiest path, but it was probably the only path. Many years later, when he had become a world champion, people often talked about his belts and victories, but very few mentioned the sacrifices that began when he was still a boy. They did not see the years of childhood traded to pursue a fragile opportunity. They did not see the times he had to give up the small joys of youth to continue training. They did not see the fear of a child who understood that if he failed, a life of poverty would await him. It was right there in Guantánamo, amid those hardships and shortages, that Joel Casamayor learned the most important lesson of his life. Not how to throw a punch, not how to win, but how to endure. Because before becoming a champion, he had to learn how to survive. If Guantánamo taught Joel Casamayor how to endure, then the Cuban boxing system taught him how to sacrifice. When the coaches began to recognize the special potential of the skinny boy from a poor family, Joel's life changed completely. From a child who grew up on dusty streets and working-class neighborhoods, he gradually stepped into a world where everything was measured by results, discipline, and the ability to win. To the outside, it seemed like an opportunity. To Joel, it was also the beginning of losses that very few saw. From a very young age, he had to leave his family for long periods to participate in the state's sports training programs. The trips became more frequent. The training sessions became longer. The returns home became shorter. While many children were still enjoying their childhood with their parents, Joel learned to sleep in dormitories, wake up before dawn, and spend most of the day training. There were weeks when he only saw his family for a very short time. There were months when his loved ones only existed through a few letters or rushed meetings. That was the first price of talent, and that was only the beginning. The Cuban sports system is famous worldwide for its ability to train champions. But behind the medals is an extremely harsh environment. The selected children had to live with pressure from a very young age. Every training session was a test. Every competition was an opportunity or a risk. Success was rewarded. Failure was remembered. Joel quickly understood that no one cared how tired you were. No one cared how much you missed home. The only thing that mattered was whether you won or not. Mornings began when the sun had not yet risen. Long runs that seemed endless. Hours of technical training repeated until his legs and shoulders felt like they would break. Many times Joel returned to the room with his whole body aching. Many times he fell asleep from exhaustion while still wearing his training clothes. But the next day, everything started over. No exceptions, no privileges, only work and endurance. Gradually, Joel's childhood disappeared. It did not disappear in one day. It was taken away little by little. Afternoons playing with friends were replaced by sparring matches. Summer vacation days were replaced by training camps. Children's naive dreams were replaced by goals of winning medals for the country. While many other boys thought about the future, Joel thought about weight, technique, and the next competition. Boxing was no longer a sport. It became his entire life. But that path was not smooth. Joel did not win everything from the beginning. He also experienced his first bitter defeats. There were fights where he stepped down from the ring with red eyes from disappointment. There were times when he felt all his efforts became meaningless after just a few minutes of fighting. Defeat was especially painful when you had sacrificed so much to be there. Joel understood that very early. Every time he lost, he was not only disappointed with the result, he also felt he was letting down his family, letting down those who believed in him, and letting down the sacrifices he had made. But it was precisely those defeats that shaped the later Joel Casamayor. Instead of giving up, he returned to the training room. Instead of blaming, he trained harder. Instead of letting defeat define him, he turned it into fuel to keep moving forward. The coaches began to notice something special in that boy. Not just technique, not just speed, but the ability to endure, the ability to stand up after falls, the ability to keep fighting when others wanted to quit. Over time, Joel became one of the most promising talents in the Cuban boxing system. But at the same time, he was also moving further away from the normal life of a child. Those years created a painful paradox. Boxing was opening a future for Joel, but it was also taking away his childhood. It brought hope to his family, but at the same time forced him to live away from them more. It promised a better tomorrow, but demanded sacrifices that a child should not have to bear. By the end of his teenage years, Joel Casamayor hardly knew any life other than boxing. Every decision in the day revolved around training. Every future plan revolved around competitions. Every dream was tied to the ring. He had traded too much to turn back. And it was precisely at that time that no one knew the boy who had once sacrificed his childhood for boxing would have to continue sacrificing many greater things in the years to come. Those years of sacrifice finally began to bear fruit. When he entered the late 1980s and early 1990s, Joel Casamayor was no longer just a promising boy in the Cuban sports system. He had become one of the best amateur boxers in the country. Each victory brought him closer to the dream that thousands of young Cuban boxers pursued, but only very few could touch: the Olympics. For most of the world, the Olympics is where the best athletes compete. But for Cuba at that time, the Olympics meant much more. It was national pride. It was proof that a small country could still stand equal to sports superpowers. Athletes like Joel did not just represent themselves. They represented the entire nation. They carried the expectations of millions of people on their shoulders. The road to Barcelona in 1992 was not easy. Casamayor had to overcome countless selection tournaments, exhausting training sessions, and competition pressure from the best Cuban boxers. Every day, he lived with the fear that even a small mistake could take away the opportunity he had spent his entire youth pursuing. But it was precisely those difficult years that turned him into a different warrior. When he stepped into the ring at the Barcelona Olympics, Joel brought not only technique or experience. He brought all the sacrifice of his childhood, all the times away from family, all the days of poverty he had endured. For him, this was not simply a competition. It was an opportunity to prove that every loss had meaning, and then that moment came. After tense fights, Joel Casamayor stepped onto the podium to receive the gold medal. The Cuban flag was raised. The national anthem rang out in the arena. Millions of Cuban people watching on television, were proud of the young man from Guantánamo who had become an Olympic champion. In that moment, Joel had everything an athlete could dream of: glory, respect, fame. He became a national hero. His name appeared in the press. Sports leaders praised him as a model for the younger generation. Children in boxing gyms began to look at him as a symbol. After many years of sacrifice, he finally reached the peak. But what makes Joel Casamayor's story different from most other sports legends lies in what happened afterward. Because when the cameras turned off and the congratulations gradually died down, he returned home and realized a painful truth. His family's life had hardly changed. The Olympic gold medal did not turn poverty into prosperity. It could not immediately bring a better life to his loved ones. Many years later, Joel recounted a story that shocked many Americans. After winning the Olympic gold medal for Cuba, the most valuable reward he received was a bicycle. For many athletes in other countries, that was almost unimaginable. An Olympic champion usually receives large cash prizes, advertising contracts, or life-changing opportunities. But Joel received a bicycle, and what he did with that bicycle made the story even more heartbreaking. Instead of keeping it as a symbol of victory, he decided to sell the bicycle. The money received was used to buy a pig for his family, a pig, not a car, not a new house, not a major asset, just a pig that could help the family improve their meals and create additional income in the future. Many years later, when remembering that decision, Joel did not speak with bitterness. But it was precisely that calmness that made the story sadder. It showed how great the gap was between sports glory and real life. He was an Olympic champion, but his family still had to worry about the most basic needs. It was also during this period that the first thoughts of a different future began to appear in Joel Casamayor's mind. At first, they were just small questions. Why could a person become an Olympic champion but still not completely change his family's life? Why did such great talent and sacrifice not bring more opportunities? Why could boxers in other countries build prosperous lives from their success, while he still had to worry about very ordinary things? Those questions did not immediately turn into a decision. He still loved Cuba. He was still proud to represent the country. He still continued to fight for the flag and colors. But a seed had been planted in his mind, the seed of doubt, the seed of the desire to determine his own future, the seed of the wish to give his family more than what he could do at that time. In the eyes of the world, Joel Casamayor was living the most glorious years of his life. But deep inside, another struggle was quietly beginning. A struggle that did not take place in the ring. There was no referee, no audience, no medal. It was the struggle between loyalty to his homeland and the desire to change his destiny. And then over time, that struggle would become the biggest decision in his entire life. In the eyes of millions of Cubans, Joel Casamayor at that time had become the embodiment of success. He was the Olympic champion. He was the sports hero. He was living proof that a poor boy from Guantánamo could still reach the top of the world. Wherever he appeared, people looked at him with admiration. Children wanted to be like him. Coaches used his name as a model for the next generation. On paper and in the media, Joel's life seemed perfect, but sometimes the most dangerous cages are built with glory. After Barcelona 1992, Joel was no longer simply a boxer. He became the property of a system. Every victory of his no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to the nation. Every fight was no longer a personal opportunity. It became a political responsibility, a sports responsibility, and a symbolic responsibility. The more successful he became, the more he felt his life no longer belonged to him. Outsiders saw the gold medal. Joel saw the invisible limits gradually closing around his life. He still continued to train, still continued to compete, still continued to win. But a question began to appear more and more often in his mind. If he had done all this, why was he still not allowed to decide his own future? That was a question not easy to answer in Cuba in the early 1990s. Joel was not free to choose his career path like professional boxers in the United States. He could not sign million-dollar contracts. He could not choose opponents as he wished. he could not use his talent to create major changes for his family's life. He was an Olympic champion, but his life was still arranged by others. From training schedules, competition schedules, to decisions related to the future, many things were beyond his control. That became even harder to accept when Joel witnessed the difference between the world he was living in and the outside world. The international athletes he met at competitions had the opportunity to build lives from their success. Meanwhile, he returned home after each victory and still saw the familiar difficulties. Still saw his family working hard. Still saw the limits that money, domestic fame, and medals could not erase. The gap between glory and reality grew larger. In the ring, he was the winner. Outside the ring, he was still a man trying to find a way to give his family a better life. The most painful thing was that Joel did not lose his love for his country. He loved Cuba. He was proud of Cuba. He had spent his entire youth fighting for the flag and colors. Every time the national anthem rang out after a victory, he felt real emotion. But love for the homeland and disappointment with the circumstances could sometimes exist at the same time. That was what made the years after the Olympics the most difficult period mentally in his life. The more successful he became, the more he felt he was standing between two opposing truths. One truth said that he had achieved the dream of millions of people. The other truth said that he still could not give his family the life they deserved. Meanwhile, the pressure to win never decreased. On the contrary, it grew larger. An Olympic gold medal did not allow you to become normal again. After standing at the peak, everyone expected you to stay there forever. Coaches expected more. Sports officials expected more. Fans expected more. Joel not only had to fight opponents, he also had to fight the enormous expectations placed on his shoulders. Every time he stepped into the ring, he no longer fought like a young athlete full of ambition. He fought like a symbol that had to protect the nation's reputation. A defeat now was no longer just a personal failure. It became the disappointment of many people. Gradually, boxing began to change its meaning in Joel's life. When he was a child, boxing was an escape from poverty. When he became a champion, boxing became what kept him in a situation he was no longer sure he wanted to continue. The dream that once helped him fly now sometimes made him feel trapped. The sad thing was that very few people realized that. Because from the outside, Joel Casamayor was still living in the most glorious years of his career. He continued to win, continued to represent Cuba on international stages, continued to be praised as a hero. No one saw the long nights when he thought about the future. No one saw the increasingly big questions in his mind. No one saw the feeling of helplessness of a man who knew he could do more for his family, but was not allowed to choose how to do it. By the mid-1990s, Joel began to understand that the biggest battle of his life might not take place in the ring. It would be the battle between loyalty and desire, between the past and the future, between the place where he was born and the life he wanted to build. And just a few years later, he would have to make a decision that no punch in the world could prepare him for. In 1996, Joel Casamayor was 25 years old. For most athletes, that was the prime age of their career. For Joel, it was the time when his life began to turn in a completely different direction. 4 years had passed since the day he stood on the highest podium in Barcelona. 4 years of continuing to fight, continuing to represent Cuba, and continuing to carry the expectations of an entire nation on his shoulders. But the questions that appeared after the Olympics were no longer fleeting thoughts. They had become persistent voices in his mind. And then a trip to Mexico changed everything. That summer, the Cuban boxing team went to Guadalajara for training in preparation for the Atlanta Olympics. On paper, this was just a normal part of the preparation plan for the Games. But for Joel Casamayor, it was the most stressful weeks of his life. Weight-related issues began to become major pressure. The coaches wanted him to compete in the weight class that fit the team's strategy. Weight control became stricter than ever. Every meal was monitored. Every training session carried pressure. Joel understood that just one small mistake could threaten his position on the team. For many people, that might just be a sports issue. But for Joel, it represented something much bigger. After more than a decade of sacrificing his childhood, sacrificing his youth, and devoting almost his entire life to Cuban boxing, he began to feel that his future was still in someone else's hands. Even as an Olympic champion, he still did not truly control his own destiny. That feeling grew heavier. Every day in Mexico felt like a reminder that his current life was not the life he wanted forever. In training sessions, Joel was still a warrior. He still did everything that was asked of him. But inside, another battle was taking place. One side was loyalty to his homeland, to those who had trained him, to the flag he had once proudly raised on the Olympic podium. The other side was the desire to live his own life, to create a better future for his family, and to use his talent in the way he believed was right. As the days passed, the gap between those two choices grew larger. And then a moment came when Joel understood that he could no longer stand between two paths. He would have to choose one. What made that decision painful was that Joel knew the consequences clearly. Escaping from Cuba was not simply changing countries. It was giving up his entire old life. It could mean losing contact with loved ones, losing his position in the country, losing the image of a national hero. Even for many Cubans at that time, an escaping athlete would be seen as a traitor. Joel understood all of that. He understood that if he crossed that line, there would be no way back. But he also understood something else. If he did not do it, he might have to live the rest of his life with regret. That fateful night came in silence. There was no speech, no emotional farewell. No one stood by to affirm that he was doing the right thing. There was only Joel Casamayor and the biggest decision of his life. When he left the Cuban team's residence in the darkness, he did not know what awaited ahead. He did not know where he would live next week. He did not know if there would be a chance for success or not. He did not know if he would ever see all his loved ones again. In reality, he knew almost nothing about the future. The only thing he knew was that if he stayed, life would continue as before. And if he left, at least there was still hope. Those footsteps in the night were probably the loneliest footsteps of Joel Casamayor's life. There were no spectators, no cheers, no medal waiting at the end of the road. Only fear, anxiety, and a fragile belief that life must have something bigger than what he had known until then. In the many years afterward, fans often mention Joel's big fights as the most courageous moments of his career. But the truth was probably different. No fight was as dangerous as the night he left the Cuban team. In the ring, he always knew the rules, always knew who the opponent was, always knew when the fight would end. But that night there were no rules at all. It was a jump into the unknown, a bet with his entire future. When the sun rose the next day, Joel Casamayor was no longer the Olympic champion preparing for Atlanta. He became a man who was not sure where he belonged. Cuba was still behind him. The United States was still far ahead. And between those two worlds was a man who had just traded everything familiar to pursue a different chance at life. That was the moment Joel Casamayor's first life ended. And it was also the moment his second life began. But before becoming a world champion, before earning the money he once did not dare to dream of, before being recognized on professional rings, he would have to go through months even more difficult than anything boxing had ever brought. Because from the night he disappeared from the Cuban team, Joel Casamayor was no longer a hero of a nation. He was only a lonely man trying to survive in a completely new world. In the days after leaving the Cuban team in Mexico, Joel Casamayor, for the first time in his life, felt the true meaning of loneliness. There were no more coaches by his side, no teammates, no Cuban flag on his chest, no training schedule arranged from morning to night. In just one night, the life he had built for more than 10 years suddenly disappeared. The things that once defined who he was no longer existed. Joel had once been an Olympic champion. But in those days, that title was almost meaningless. It did not help him have a place to stay. It did not help him know where to go. It did not help him answer the most important question: what would happen next? Stories about escaping athletes are often told as courageous adventures. But the reality was far less glamorous. It was full of fear, full of anxiety, and sometimes full of despair. Joel lived in a state of almost constant alertness. He did not know who could help him. He did not know who could endanger him. He did not know who truly stood by his side. Those first days passed in a state where he always felt like he was being chased by his own past. Every strange phone call made him tense. Every unfamiliar face made him cautious. He knew he had made an irreversible decision, but that did not make the fear disappear. On the contrary, it made everything more real than ever. For the first time in his life, Joel understood the feeling of a person who no longer belonged to the place where he was born, but had not yet belonged to the place he was heading toward. Cuba was left behind, but the United States was still a distant dream. He stood in the middle, where nothing was certain. What pained Joel the most was not material shortages. He had grown up in poverty and was used to enduring. What really hurt him was the break with his old life. The familiar streets of Guantánamo were now thousands of miles away. His loved ones were no longer present in daily life. The people who had accompanied him throughout his youth now belonged to another world. In just one night, he became a stranger to his own homeland. There were times when Joel wondered what his family was thinking, whether they were worried, whether they understood his decision, whether they would forgive him. But most of the time, he had no answers, and it was precisely that uncertainty that created a quiet pain that lasted for many years afterward. In the eyes of many Cubans at that time, escaping athletes had abandoned their country. Joel understood that. He knew there would be people who called him a traitor. He knew there would be people who would never accept his choice. But what tormented him was that he had never felt he betrayed Cuba. He still loved the place where he was born. He was still proud of the years wearing the national team jersey. He still carried in his heart the memories of those who had helped him grow up. That was what made everything more painful, because sometimes the hardest thing is not leaving what you hate, but leaving what you love. In the following weeks and months, Joel gradually realized that the new life would not begin with glory. It would begin with loss. He was no longer Cuba's Olympic hero. There were no more praising articles, no more congratulations, no more special status. Everything had to start over from the beginning. Even in many moments, he felt smaller than ever. There is a truth that very few mention when telling stories about escaping athletes. It is the feeling of invisibility from losing one's identity. For many years, Joel knew exactly who he was. He was a Cuban boxer. He was an Olympic champion. He was the nation's pride. But now what was he? An immigrant? A refugee? A boxer looking for a new opportunity? No one could answer for him. And Joel himself had to take many years to find that answer. There were nights when he lay awake for hours, thinking about everything he had left behind. There were moments when he wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The future was completely uncertain. No one guaranteed he would succeed in the United States. No one guaranteed he would become a world champion. No one guaranteed those sacrifices would be rewarded. The only thing he had was the fragile belief that life must have something better waiting ahead. And because of that belief, he continued to move forward. But even when he had decided not to turn back, Joel still carried a strange feeling that lasted for many years afterward. The feeling of not fully belonging anywhere. In Cuba, he no longer existed. In the United States, he had not really started. He was like a person standing on a bridge connecting two worlds, looking at both sides but unable to live fully in either. That was the first price of the escape. Not money, not fame, but the feeling of becoming a man without a country. And in the following years, Joel Casamayor would have to learn to live with that feeling before he could turn himself into a champion once again. But to become a champion once again, Joel Casamayor first had to learn how to become an ordinary person. That was probably the biggest shock of his life. For many years, he was one of the most famous athletes in Cuba. He had once stepped onto the highest Olympic podium. He had once been praised as the nation's pride. He had once received respect wherever he appeared. Yet when he set foot in the United States, all of that almost disappeared. For most Americans at that time, Joel Casamayor was just another Cuban immigrant trying to start a new life. No one knew who he was. No one cared that he had once won an Olympic gold medal. No one gave him any privileges. The new life began from absolute zero. And for a person who had once stood at the top of the world, having to start over from the beginning was a painful and humbling experience. The first days in the United States were full of bewilderment. Joel could not speak English fluently. Simple conversations sometimes became challenges. He could defeat the best boxers in the world in the ring, but had difficulty reading a road sign or completing basic daily procedures. Every time he stepped outside, he clearly felt he was a stranger. Language was not just a communication tool. It was also the feeling of belonging somewhere, and in that period, Joel almost had no such feeling. He lived in a country full of opportunities, but also full of distances. American culture was completely different from what he had known in Cuba. The pace of life was faster. People were more independent. Everything seemed to operate under completely new rules. There were times when he felt like a child who had to learn everything from the beginning, not learning how to punch or dodge, but learning how to exist in a new society. Meanwhile, financial pressure did not allow him much time to adapt. Joel did not come to the United States with great assets or a prepared life. He came with hope and very little else. Daily expenses quickly became a constant worry. For the first time in many years, he had to seriously think about making a living. In Cuba, boxing was a national responsibility. In the United States, boxing was a job. If he wanted to survive, he had to turn his talent into real income. But that was not easy, because professional boxing was completely different from the amateur world he had once dominated. In the Cuban system, Joel was a star. In the United States, he was a newcomer. An Olympic gold medal brought some respect, but it did not automatically turn you into a professional star. He still had to prove himself from the beginning, still had to convince promoters, still had to seek opportunities, still had to step into the ring and win fight by fight. It was a journey full of pressure, because this time he was no longer fighting for medals. He was fighting to survive. There is a very big difference between competing for national honor and competing for a living. Joel felt that clearly in every first day in the United States. Every fight now was tied to rent, bills, and his family's future. Every victory had a much more practical meaning than before. That was the pressure that fans who only saw the ring rarely understood. Fortunately, Joel was not completely alone. In Florida, especially the Miami area, he found a large Cuban community. People who had once experienced leaving their homeland. People who understood homesickness. People who understood the feeling of standing between two worlds. It was that community that helped him gradually find balance again. In neighborhoods where Spanish echoed on the streets, in restaurants with familiar Cuban flavors, Joel for the first time felt he was not completely lost. He still missed his homeland, but at least he no longer had to carry that longing alone. Gradually, life began to stabilize more. Joel learned to adapt to the United States. He learned English better, understood how professional boxing worked, built new relationships, sought people who believed in his talent. But that process did not happen overnight. It stretched over many years with countless small difficulties that outsiders rarely saw. There were days when he felt tired from constantly having to prove himself. There were nights when he wondered if he had traded too much. Because every new step forward came with memories of what had been lost. But Joel continued to move forward, perhaps because he understood that he had no other choice. He had left Cuba, had given up his old life, had accepted becoming an exile. If he stopped now, all those sacrifices would become meaningless. And so the man who had once lost his homeland to seek a future began to build the first bricks for his new life. No longer the Olympic champion of Cuba, not yet the world champion of the United States. Just a man trying to prove that the most painful decision of his life would eventually bring some meaning. And very soon after that, professional boxing would give him the opportunity to prove it to the whole world. But the opportunity only truly means something when one is capable of seizing it. After the months of struggling to adapt to the new life in the United States, Joel Casamayor finally had the chance to step into the professional ring. That was the moment he had been waiting for since the night he left Mexico. That was the reason he traded his homeland, traded safety, and traded his old life. However, professional boxing did not welcome him with the respect that an Olympic champion usually receives. Instead, it welcomed him with skepticism. In the eyes of many in the United States, Joel Casamayor was an excellent Cuban boxer in the amateur system. But that did not equate to success in the professional world. Boxing history had seen not a few amateur champions fail when transitioning to professional competition. Those two worlds, though both boxing, operated under completely different rules. Joel understood that from his first fights. In the amateur system, speed, technique, and scoring played a very big role. The fights were shorter, the pace was different, and the goals were different. But in professional boxing, everything was much harsher. The fights were longer, the opponents were tougher, the punches were heavier, mistakes cost more dearly. This was no longer a place to win medals. This was a place to make a living. And very quickly, Joel realized that talent alone was not enough. He had to relearn many things from the beginning. He had to adjust his fighting style. He had to adapt to longer rounds. He had to learn how to distribute his energy for 10 or 12 rounds instead of 3 rounds like in the amateur days. It was a process that was not easy at all for a person who had been familiar with one system for many years. But Joel had no other choice. Every time he stepped into the ring, he was not only fighting the opponent in front of him, he was also fighting the doubts of the entire world around him. Many experts believed that Cuban boxers often relied too much on the amateur style and would struggle when entering the brutal professional environment. Some said Joel was too old to start over. Others said he would never reach the highest level. Joel heard all of that, but he did not respond with words. He responded with victories. Fight after fight, he kept moving forward. No noise. No boasting, just simply doing his job. The first victories did not make him a star, but they helped him survive. They helped him pay the bills. They helped him continue to nurture the dream that he had traded so much to pursue. And most importantly, they helped him hold on to the belief that the decision to leave Cuba was not a mistake. Because there were nights after the fight ended, when the crowd had gone home and the locker room became quiet, Joel still thought about the past. He thought about his family, thought about Guantánamo, thought about the life he once had, and sometimes he wondered if all those losses were truly worth it. In moments like that, victory became more important than ever. Each win was like an answer, proof that he had not traded everything in vain. Each step forward in his professional career was an affirmation that the new future was gradually taking shape. But the pressure never disappeared. In fact, it became even greater than before. If he failed in Cuba, Joel still had the system behind him to support him. If he failed in the United States, he could lose everything. Boxing was now not just a sport. It was a livelihood. It was the only chance to turn the sacrifices into something meaningful. That made him train harder than ever. People who worked with Joel during this period all mentioned his amazing discipline. He trained as if every day determined his future. Because in Joel's mind, it really was like that. He had no safety net, no backup plan, no way back. The first years in professional boxing were also the time when Joel began to receive respect from the boxing community. They saw what the record books could not fully show. They saw an extremely intelligent boxer, a person with excellent fight-reading ability, a southpaw with subtle defensive technique and counterpunching ability that always kept opponents cautious. Most importantly, they saw a man carrying rare determination, a person who did not fight purely for fame or money. He fought for his life. Over time, the number of wins increased. His reputation grew. Bigger opportunities began to appear. But the most memorable thing in this period was not in the numbers. It was in Joel Casamayor's will, the will of a man who had lost his homeland but refused to lose his future as well. The will of a man who understood that if he did not succeed in the United States, all the pain, the sleepless nights, and the years of sacrifices would become meaningless. It was precisely that thought that helped him keep moving forward, when many others might have collapsed long ago. And then, fight by fight, Joel Casamayor began to move closer to what he had imagined from the first day he set foot on American soil. Not just survival, not just recognition, but the opportunity to become a world champion once again. When the first victories helped Joel Casamayor stand firm on American soil, a new chapter also began to open. It was the chapter where he no longer had to fight to be noticed. He had to fight to survive among the best boxers in the world. And it was precisely during this period that Joel entered the most painful years of his life. Not because of poverty, not because of exile, but because of the terrible price that professional boxing demanded from those who wanted to stand at the top. When Joel moved closer to the big title fights, the quality of opponents changed completely. There were no more young boxers looking for opportunities. There were no more fights to accumulate experience. In front of him now were champions, belt hunters, and men willing to do anything to protect their positions. Every time he stepped into the ring was a real war. A small mistake could end a career. A precise punch could change a life. Joel did not possess destructive power like some of his contemporaries. He was not the type of boxer who made audiences go crazy with lightning knockouts. What made him special was his intelligence, his toughness, and his ability to survive in the harshest moments. But to maintain that, his body had to pay the price every day. The early years of the 2000s saw Joel constantly facing the top boxers in the world. Each fight was like a small war. After each victory, he carried a few more new scars, a few more new pains, a few more injuries that no camera could capture. The audience saw arms raised after victory. Joel felt aching shoulders when he woke up the next morning. The audience saw championship belts. Joel saw cuts on his face that needed stitches. The audience saw glory. Joel felt the price of glory in every step he took. One of the things that made Casamayor's career special was that he was often underestimated compared to his opponents. Even as an Olympic champion with top-level technique, Joel rarely received attention like the other big boxing stars. He did not have the media appeal of famous American boxers. He did not have a powerful promotional team behind him. Many times entering big fights, people believed the opponent would be the one to win. But that was also when Joel became the most dangerous. He turned doubt into motivation. He turned being underestimated into fuel. He fought like a man who could not accept defeat. Because deep inside, Joel always carried the memory of the night he left Cuba. He knew he had traded too much to be standing here. He could not allow those sacrifices to become meaningless. In 2000, he defeated Robbie Peden to win the WBA Super Featherweight World Championship belt. It was an important milestone, but the joy did not last long. In boxing, holding the top is always harder than climbing to the top. Belt hunters appeared constantly. The fights became increasingly brutal. The pressure grew larger. And then Diego Corrales appeared. In the history of Joel Casamayor's career, very few names left as deep an impression as Diego Corrales. Corrales was the type of boxer audiences loved. Powerful, tough, always ready to go to war. Their confrontation was not simply a title fight. It was a clash between two iron wills. When stepping into the ring to face Corrales, Joel knew he would have to go through hell if he wanted to win. The fight played out exactly like that. Punches were exchanged continuously. Rounds dragged on in pain. No one backed down. No one accepted surrender. Every minute that passed was a test of both body and spirit. When the fight ended with victory belonging to Joel Casamayor, many people only saw the result. They did not see what had been taken from his body in exchange for that victory. The years after that were not any easier. José Luis Castillo, Acelino Freitas, Michael Katsidis, each name represented a new war. Each war took away another part of Joel's remaining youth. When facing Acelino Freitas in 2004, Joel was knocked down twice in the fight. Many people believed he had no chance left, but he still got up. He still continued to fight. And in the end, he forced Freitas to quit in the 10th round. That was the type of victory that defined Joel Casamayor's entire career. Not flashy, not easy, not perfect, but full of resilience. As he got older, the fights became more painful. His body no longer recovered as quickly as before. The pains lasted longer. The wounds took more time to heal. There were mornings when Joel woke up and felt like his whole body had been run over by a truck. There were days when he could not move normally without feeling aches. But he still continued, because boxing was no longer just a profession. It was the reason that made all previous sacrifices meaningful. It was proof that the poor boy in Guantánamo had not surrendered. It was the answer to all those who had once doubted him. It was the bridge connecting his first life and his second life. Looking back on that period, it is hard to determine what was Joel Casamayor's greatest victory. It could be the belts. It could be the wins against top opponents. But it could also be the fact that he still stood firm after all of it. Because every time the referee raised Joel's hand after a bloody battle, the public only saw a champion. But Joel felt more clearly than anyone what boxing was quietly taking away from him. Year after year, fight after fight, punch after punch. And that price would become clearer than ever when he approached the final peak of his career. But all those bloody years finally brought Joel Casamayor to the place he had been pursuing since the day he set foot on American soil. After countless battles, countless times being doubted, and countless times having to prove himself, he was no longer just a former Olympic gold medalist trying to survive in professional boxing. He had become a world champion. For many boxers, that was the perfect ending to a story. For Joel, it was only the moment he realized that even the greatest dreams sometimes could not fill all the voids in a person's heart. When the World Championship belt was placed around his waist, Joel had achieved what millions of boxers around the planet only dared to dream of. From the poor boy in Guantánamo, he had become an Olympic champion. From the man who escaped Cuba in the darkness of night, he had become a world champion on American soil. No one could say he failed. No one could deny what he had achieved. All the sacrifices seemed to have been rewarded. The years away from family, the days living in anxiety after the escape, the battles that left his body full of scars, the times being looked down upon, the times being underestimated. All of it seemed to lead to this moment. But the strange thing was that the joy did not last as long as he had once imagined. Joel had spent many years thinking that if one day he became a world champion, all the pain would have meaning. He believed that the peak would bring a feeling of completeness, that everything lost would be compensated by success. But when he finally touched the greatest dream of his life, he discovered a truth that many champions had experienced. There are things that cannot be bought with money. There are losses that cannot be replaced by titles. And there are voids that even the World Championship belt cannot fill. In the quiet nights after the big victories, Joel often thought about the life he had left behind. He thought about Guantánamo, thought about the streets where he once ran barefoot as a child, thought about the poor house where his parents had tried to support the whole family through hardships, thought about the first years in the Cuban boxing gym, thought about the people who had contributed to making him who he was. A part of that life now only existed in memories. Joel was living in the United States. He had built a new life. He had fame, a career, and successes that before had been almost unimaginable. But memories do not disappear just because a person achieves what they want. On the contrary, sometimes success even makes one remember the past more. Because when you finally climb to the top of the mountain, you have more time to look back at the path you have taken. What pained Joel the most was not the material hardships of the past. It was that there were loved ones who could not truly share and enjoy that success with him. In the boxing world, people often see the champion standing in the spotlight. But very few think about the people who were not there. The people who had accompanied him in the hardest days. The people who had seen the boy Joel before the world knew his name. The people who had sacrificed so he could pursue boxing. There were victories that Joel wished he could share in a different way. There were moments when he wished the gap between the present and the past was not so great. There were times when he looked around after a big victory and clearly felt his own loneliness. That may sound hard to understand to many people. How can a world champion be lonely? How can a person who has just achieved what millions dream of feel like something is missing? But Joel Casamayor's life had never been simple. He was not just a boxer. He was a man who had lived two lives. And sometimes, no matter how successful, a part of his soul was still trapped where his first life ended. During the peak years of his career, Joel continued to defend his reputation against top opponents. He continued to win, continued to be respected, continued to affirm his position in world boxing. But inside, he increasingly understood that success and happiness were not always the same. One could achieve all the goals they had pursued and still carry sorrows that never completely disappeared. Perhaps that was why Joel had never become the type of star who liked to show off. He understood the value of success more than most people because he knew exactly how much he had paid to get it. Each belt carried a part of his youth. Each victory carried a part of his memories. Each time he was honored reminded him of what he had traded. And while the world saw a champion standing at the peak of boxing power, Joel Casamayor saw a man who was still trying to reconcile with his own past. A man who had achieved the greatest dream but still sometimes wondered if there was anything in life big enough to compensate for everything he had lost. But time is an opponent that no champion can defeat forever. For many years, Joel Casamayor had overcome poverty, overcome exile, overcome the most fearsome opponents in world boxing. He had survived battles that many believed he could not overcome. Yet there was a silent war that took place every day that even the strongest will could not stop. It was the war with age. And like every other boxer, Joel finally had to face the truth that the human body was not made to endure endless wars. The peak years of his career had brought him fame, money, and respect, but they had also left debts that the body had to pay gradually over time. Each punch endured, each time knocked down, each 12-round war, each weight cut, each training session to exhaustion, all accumulated like small cracks on a structure that seemed unbreakable. When he was young, Joel could fight on the weekend and return to the gym just a few days later. The body recovered quickly. The wounds disappeared quickly. The pains were only temporary. But when he entered his mid-30s and approached 40, everything began to change. The pains no longer disappeared as quickly as before. The wounds took many weeks to recover. The mornings became more difficult. The body began to send signals that he could not ignore. Many years later, people who had worked with Joel all mentioned his extraordinary endurance. But even the strongest people could not defeat the laws of nature. After hundreds of amateur fights and dozens of brutal professional battles, Joel's body began to show signs of a man who had spent his entire life fighting. The joints ached more frequently. Shoulders and back became sources of prolonged pain. Old injuries occasionally returned to remind him of the battles that had passed. There was no warning bell for that decline. It came very slowly, very quietly, and that was precisely what made it more frightening. At first, Joel still tried to ignore it all. He continued to train as before, continued to step into the ring, continued to believe that experience could compensate for what age was taking away. For a period of time, that actually worked. His tactical intelligence was still among the best. His fight-reading ability still surprised many younger opponents. But then one day, Joel began to notice things that had never happened before. He saw punches a fraction of a second later. He moved a little slower. His reflexes were no longer as sharp as in his prime. His power recovery after each round also decreased. Those were not big changes. But in boxing, sometimes a fraction of a second is enough to change the outcome of the entire fight. Joel understood that better than anyone. He had once used moments like that to defeat countless opponents. Now, he was the one facing them. Losses began to appear more often in the final stage of his career, not because he suddenly became a worse boxer, but because boxing is a cruel sport. It does not care how great you once were. It only cares who you are at the present moment. In 2008, Joel lost to Juan Manuel Marquez in a big fight. That was one of the moments that showed time was gradually catching up with him. Marquez was younger, faster, and in his prime. Joel still fought with all his experience and pride. But sometimes experience cannot resist age forever. In the years after that, defeats began to appear more frequently. Each loss was painful, not just because of the result, but because Joel knew clearly what was happening. He was no longer fighting opponents. He was fighting time. And this was a war that no one had ever won. Perhaps the hardest part was not the losses. It was accepting them. Throughout his life, Joel Casamayor had always been a man who fought to move forward. He fought to escape poverty, fought to become an Olympic champion, fought to survive after the escape, fought to conquer professional boxing. But now he had to learn something completely different. Learn how to let go. Learn how to accept. Learn how to understand that every journey has an ending. That was the hardest lesson for any champion. Because people like Joel were not born to surrender. They were born to fight. Yet there are battles where wisdom lies in knowing when to stop. When looking in the mirror, Joel began to see a different man from the young man who had once left Cuba. His hair was different, his body was different. More scars, more pains. But what made him think the most was the question of how he wanted to be remembered. As a fighter clinging to the past, or as a champion who knew how to leave with dignity. In the end, Joel chose the second option. The decision to leave the ring did not come in a single moment. It was the result of many years of thinking, many years of listening to his body, and many years of accepting reality. It was a painful but necessary decision. When the final chapter of his boxing career closed, Joel Casamayor did not leave as a failure. He left as a man who had given this sport everything he had: youth, health, blood, sweat, tears, and the best years of his life. But what Joel had not realized at that time was that the biggest remaining battle was no longer in the ring. It was in his own heart. Because after the final bell rang and the stage lights gradually dimmed, the man who had lived two lives for many decades would have to face the question he had always tried to avoid. What was all that sacrifice ultimately for? Perhaps the answer to that question does not lie in the championship belts, nor in the battles that made the whole world remember Joel Casamayor's name. Because when the stage lights went out and the final bell fell silent, Joel gradually realized that the most precious thing in his life had never been boxing. Boxing was only the means. What he had always tried to protect, always tried to build, and always carried in his heart from the days when he was still the poor boy in Guantánamo was family. If there had been no family, perhaps Joel would never have stepped into the first boxing gym. If there had been no family, he would not have endured the years of sacrificial childhood. And if there had been no family, perhaps he would not have had the courage to carry out the escape that changed his entire life. In many stories about sports champions, people often focus on the trophies, the victories, or the glorious moments. But behind every champion, there are usually people who are mentioned less. People who silently endured, sacrificed, and accompanied them in the hardest times. Joel Casamayor's life was no different. During the turbulent years of his exile life, his wife became one of the most important anchors. Although Joel was always private about his personal life, people who knew him understood that family was where he found peace after the long battles in the ring. When the world saw a strong warrior, family saw a man full of pressure and wounds that were not always visible on the body. The first years in the United States were not easy for anyone in the family. Joel had to build his career from scratch. The future was completely uncertain. Money was not always stable. Every fight carried survival pressure. In that situation, his wife's presence was not only love, but also a source of strength that helped him keep moving forward. There were days when everything became too difficult. There were times when his career had not brought the desired results. There were moments when Joel had to wonder if all his sacrifices were truly worth it. It was precisely in times like that that family helped him hold on to his belief. Not the promoters, not the press, not the fans, but the people who were always there when things were at their worst. Then when the children came into his life, Joel's motivation changed once again. Before, he fought to escape poverty. Later, he fought to prove that the decision to leave Cuba was right. But when he became a father, he began to fight for a different reason. He wanted his children to have opportunities he had never had. He wanted them to grow up in a more stable life. He wanted them to be able to choose their own future without having to trade harsh things like he had experienced. That made each fight carry a different meaning. Joel no longer stepped into the ring just for himself. He stepped into the ring for the family waiting for him to come home, for the children who believed their father could do anything, for the loved ones who had gone through the hardest years with him. Perhaps that was why Joel always kept his private life away from the media. In an era when many athletes turned their personal lives into headlines, Joel chose a completely different path. He rarely appeared in scandals, rarely shared too much about his family with the public, rarely sought attention outside the ring, partly because of his naturally reserved personality, but also partly because he understood the value of peace. After all the upheavals that life had brought, what Joel wanted to protect the most was not his star image, but his loved ones. Many years after leaving the peak of boxing, people who met Joel often noticed something special. He rarely talked much about his titles, rarely boasted about his victories. Instead, he often talked about family, talked about the people who had helped him overcome difficulties, talked about the normal life he had once longed for in his younger years. That is perhaps not too hard to understand, because Joel had spent most of his life pursuing great goals. He had once become an Olympic champion, once become a world champion, once defeated the top boxers on the planet. But the farther he went, the more he understood that the belts would eventually age. The fights would eventually become memories. Fame would also fade over time. Only family remained. Only the people who loved him unconditionally existed after the stage lights went out. That was why, when looking back at the entire journey from Guantánamo to the peak of world boxing, Joel Casamayor did not consider the belts his greatest achievement. His greatest achievement was having built a better life for the people he loved. It was that the children who had once grown up in difficult circumstances now had the opportunity to live differently. It was that the man who once did not know what tomorrow would bring had finally built a real home. And it was precisely when everything on the outside gradually calmed down that Joel realized that everything he had fought to protect had never been fame. It had always been family. But even when he had found the most important thing in life, there was still a deep wound that he had carried for many decades. A wound that had nothing to do with boxing, nothing to do with money or titles. It was the feeling of living between two worlds, between two homelands, and between two lives that no one really saw. And that was also the moment we touched the saddest truth in Joel Casamayor's entire story. It was not the losses, it was not the injuries, it was not the years of poverty, but the fact that he had lived for more than 35 years between two different lives. One life that began in Cuba and one life that was built in the United States. Most people only saw the final result. They saw the Olympic gold medal. They saw the world champion. They saw a successful man after escaping Cuba. But very few understood the feeling of having to carry two identities in the same heart for many decades. Joel Casamayor had never completely abandoned his first life. He could leave Cuba with his feet, but he could never take Cuba out of his memories. His first life began in Guantánamo, among the poor streets, the simple houses, and the working families who always had to struggle with life. That was where the boy Joel first learned how to endure. That was where he saw his parents working hard to support the family. That was where boxing entered his life as a rare opportunity to change his destiny. That was also where he learned loyalty, resilience, and national pride. When standing on the podium to receive the Olympic gold medal in Barcelona in 1992, Joel did not just represent himself. He represented Cuba. He represented the ordinary people who had once seen hope in sports. He represented the poor children who believed they could also do something miraculous. In that moment, he was the hero of an entire country. But then the second life began, a life without the national anthem ringing out after victories, without praise from state media, without the feeling of belonging to something greater than himself. The second life began with loneliness, with fear, with sleepless nights, with having to relearn how to exist on completely foreign land. Joel had to build everything from scratch, a new identity, a new career, a new life, a new future. If the first life was the story of a national hero, then the second life was the story of an immigrant trying to survive. The most painful thing was that both of those lives were real. Joel could not choose one and erase the other. He could not pretend that Cuba had never existed, but he also could not live forever in the past. So he carried both, day after day, year after year. There were mornings when he woke up on American soil, but his mind drifted back to Guantánamo. There were nights after winning big, when he still remembered the streets where he once ran as a child. There were times when watching his children grow up in a more stable life, he thought about the hardships his parents had once endured. The memories of his homeland had never really disappeared. They only changed shape over time. Sometimes they appeared in a Spanish song, sometimes in the smell of Cuban food, sometimes in the voices of fellow countrymen, and sometimes they appeared at the most unexpected moments, reminding him that although he had lived most of his adult life in the United States, a part of his soul would forever remain where he was born. That was precisely what created the paradox that Joel had to live with for many decades. He belonged to two worlds, but also did not fully belong to either. In Cuba, he had once been a hero, but after the escape, that image was no longer intact as before. In the United States, he built success, won world championship belts, and created a new life, but he always carried the feeling of a person who had to start over from the beginning. There are immigrants who finally find where they truly belong. For Joel, the story was more complicated. He loved the United States for the opportunities this country brought. He knew his life would be very different if he had not made the decision in 1996. But he also could not stop loving Cuba. He could not stop missing the place that had shaped him. That was why, for many years, he lived between reality and nostalgia, between the present and the past, between what he had achieved and what he had left behind. That was the mental price that many people do not see when mentioning escaping athletes. People often talk about money, fame, and success, but few talk about the long nights when a person wonders if they still belong to their homeland. Few talk about the feeling of looking back at youth as if looking at the life of another person. Few talk about carrying homesickness for many decades, with no complete way to resolve it. Joel Casamayor had never publicly turned those things into tragedy. That was not his personality. He had always been a man who silently endured. Just like the way he endured punches in the ring, just like the way he endured the years of childhood poverty. But silence does not mean the pain did not exist. It only meant he had learned to live with it. And perhaps that was what made Joel's story special. He did not win because life was easy. He won because he continued to move forward despite carrying losses that most people never see. For 35 years, he lived between two lives. One life he was forced to leave. One life he had to rebuild with his own hands. And it was right in the middle of those two worlds that Joel Casamayor found himself. Not completely the Olympic hero of Cuba, not just the world champion of the United States, but a man who had spent his entire life learning how to live with his own most painful choices. And now, when looking back at that entire journey from his 50s, he could clearly see what very few people realize. His greatest success was not the Olympic gold medal. It was not the World Championship belts. It was the fact that he still stood firm after everything life had taken away. And that is perhaps the saddest truth about Joel Casamayor at 55 years old. It is not that he has grown old. It is not that the stage lights have gone out. It is not that the championship belts now lie quietly in glass cases covered with the dust of time. It is that his life proves that sometimes the people who win the most are also the ones who have to trade the most. Today, Joel Casamayor no longer lives in the frantic pace of peak boxing. There are no more training camps lasting for months. There are no more stressful weigh-ins. There are no more press conferences where dozens of reporters surround him with questions. His life now is much quieter. A life where most of the time is spent with family, with the simple things he once did not have the chance to enjoy in his younger years. His body is no longer as it was. The wounds from boxing are still there. The pains accumulated from decades of fighting still occasionally appear as reminders of the past. But Joel has learned how to live with them, just like the way he learned to live with homesickness, just like the way he learned to live with the losses that no one sees. When looking back at his entire journey, it is hard to believe that it all started from a poor boy in Guantánamo, a boy who grew up in deprivation. A boy with no money, no privileges, and no guarantees about the future. If someone had told the Joel of the 1970s that one day he would become an Olympic champion, a world champion, and be remembered as one of the greatest Cuban boxers in history, perhaps even he would have hard to believe. But that was exactly what happened, step by step, year by year, sacrifice by sacrifice. However, Joel's story had never been just a story of success. It was a story of the price paid for success, because every major achievement in his life came with another major loss. To become an elite boxer, he had to trade his childhood. While other children grew up with their families, Joel grew up in training centers and competition trips. To become an Olympic champion, he had to accept a life controlled by discipline and expectations. To become a world champion, he had to leave his homeland. And to build a new life in the United States, he had to give up almost everything that had once been familiar. That was what made his story different from many other champions. Joel did not just fight opponents in the ring. He also fought poverty, fought uncertainty, fought loneliness, fought the feeling of not belonging anywhere, fought time, and finally fought his own memories. There are people who achieve success by keeping everything. Joel achieved success by constantly having to let go. But it was precisely those sacrifices that also created the special legacy he left behind. For Cuban boxing, Joel Casamayor is part of the golden generation that proved to the world that that small country could produce top-level boxers. The Olympic gold medal in Barcelona in 1992 remains one of the proudest milestones in Cuban boxing history. He is a symbol of technique, intelligence, and a fighting spirit that never surrenders. For world boxing, Joel is proof that Cuban boxers can succeed in two completely different worlds. He conquered amateur boxing at the highest level, then built an excellent professional career in the United States, where countless amateur champions had once failed. Not many boxers in history have done that. But perhaps Joel's greatest legacy is not in the titles. It lies in the story of his life. Because when people mention Joel Casamayor, they do not just mention the belts. They mention courage. Courage to leave everything familiar and step into the unknown. Courage to start over from zero when most people would choose safety. Courage to keep moving forward even when there was no guarantee that success would come. They mention endurance. Endurance through years of poverty. Endurance through brutal training sessions. Endurance through injuries. Endurance through mental losses lasting for decades. And they mention resilience. The resilience of a man who never let circumstances decide his destiny. The resilience of a man who always stood up after every fall. The resilience of a man who had lived two lives but did not let either life defeat him. In the end, the saddest truth about Joel Casamayor is not what he lost. It is that he had to trade so much to get what he achieved. But it is also precisely that which makes his story memorable. Because in a world full of stories about talent and victory, Joel Casamayor reminds us that what makes a legend is not the number of times that person wins, but the number of times they continue to move forward when life gives them reasons to stop. And if there is one thing that Joel Casamayor's journey proves most clearly, it is this: a person can lose their homeland, can lose their youth, can lose many things on the road of life, but if they do not lose their will, they can still create an extraordinary life. That is the greatest victory of Joel Casamayor, not in the ring, but in his own life. Joel Casamayor's story leaves me with a feeling that is both heartbreaking and full of respect. What makes people feel the most sorrow is not the bloody fights with Diego Corrales, Acelino Freitas, or Juan Manuel Marquez, nor the injuries he had to carry into old age. The most heartbreaking thing is that a person had to constantly trade the most precious things in life in order to survive and move forward. From the poor boy in Guantánamo who grew up in deprivation, Joel sacrificed his childhood to enter the Cuban boxing system. When he won the Olympic gold medal in Barcelona in 1992, that should have been the moment that completely changed his family's life. But the painful reality was that the greatest reward he received was only a bicycle, and he had to sell it to buy a pig to help his family improve their lives. That detail shows the harsh gap between glory and reality that Joel had to face. After that, he continued to sacrifice something even greater, leaving his homeland in the night in Mexico in 1996 to seek a different future for himself and his family. What is admirable is that Joel did not let adversity turn him into a bitter person. Even though he had to live between two worlds, always carrying the longing for Cuba and the feeling of not fully belonging anywhere, he still rebuilt his life from zero in the United States, becoming a world champion through his own talent, discipline, and extraordinary resilience. For the American people, this story is a profound reminder that true success does not lie only in money, titles, or fame. Success lies in the ability to stand up after loss, the courage to accept to change one's destiny, and still maintaining kindness, love for family, and one's dignity after all of it. Joel Casamayor is not just boxing champion. He is a symbol of the strength of the human spirit when facing the most painful choices in life. If Joel Casamayor's story has touched your heart, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share the video so more people can know about the extraordinary journey of a man who traded his entire homeland to pursue a future for his family. Thank you for accompanying us to the end of the story, and see you again in the next video with another life, another destiny, but also full of lessons about resilience, sacrifice, and the strength of the human spirit.